This is Steve Rodgers from Earth 123. And growing up in Brooklyn, New York, he got picked on a lot for being a little guy. But although he was much smaller than most people, he was known for having a lot of heart. Because throughout his entire life, all he ever wanted to do was just serve his country by being in the military and becoming one of the greatest football players of all time. So today I am putting Steve Rodgers into College Football 26. Let's see how far this 5'5" negative star athlete can go in his career as we follow him on his road to glory. You see, now going into his senior year of high school, Steve Rodgers was not highly recruited at all. There weren't many, if any, teams that wanted anything to do with him, but he knew that whoever would give him a chance, he would do everything he could to win them a national championship. So he felt pretty confident going into his senior year as he would finally become the starting quarterback for his high school team. And Steve was definitely hoping that he'll be able to come out here and make some plays, but he was definitely having some trouble early on. You see, unfortunately, Steve was not really big, fast, or strong. But his team did know that he had a ton of heart, so they rallied behind him regardless of what people said about him. But at this point, Steve Rodgers' skill set can really only take him so far. He had continued to struggle all throughout his senior season, and unfortunately he was getting little to no attention at all from college scouts, and the only interest he seemed to have from schools would be for academic purposes. But although Steve was not impressing a ton of coaches throughout the nation, eventually there were some coaches who started to recognize Steve's toughness, which brings us to the final game of Steve Rodgers' high school career, where in the fourth quarter his team needed him to come up big. He had a chance to help take down his team's biggest rival, so when it absolutely mattered most, Steve Rodgers would deliver a dime downfield, and he was hitting a player in stride that was able to make his way downfield for a touchdown. Steve Rodgers makes a play in one of the biggest moments of the game, helping his team come up with a win and finally closing out his high school career. Where at this point Steve still doesn't really know where he wants to go to college, but it turns out that there was one place in particular that had loved his leadership and they wanted him to come to them. So eventually, Steve Rodgers would have to decide on what he wanted to do for his college career. His top three choices turned out to be the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force. Ultimately though, for Steve Rodgers' college decision, he would decide to sign with the Army Black Knights. And now that Steve Rodgers is officially in the Army, he cannot wait to lock in and get to work with his squad. They're allowing him at the moment to be the third string quarterback. But you know what, man? Steve was ready to work as hard as he can to work his way up the depth chart. He was actually doing surprisingly well at practice, but you know there was no way that the coaches were going to let him play in the first game of the year. And unfortunately, this would actually be a game where Army would end up losing, but one thing that they realized that they might have gained was a true leader in the locker room. Because one day the coaches decided to put this team to a test, and Steve Rodgers was the only one who passed. Being willing to jump on a grenade for his teammates meant that Steve would actually get a chance to move up to QB2. And hey, despite the fact that Steve was extremely small and kinda weak, he was still impressing the coaches enough to have them feeling like he deserved to move up. But I'll tell you guys right now, it wasn't even just that. Because by the time week 8 came around, the Army was 5-1. And with Steve Rodgers continuing to excel as a leader, they realized that it was time for him to change his number because they decided that he was about to become a part of a new program. The US Army had been testing out technology for years so that they can one day produce super players, and Steve Rodgers was becoming one of their first test subjects. All they had to do now was just hope that he would survive the transformation, and oh my god, this dude is jacked. Steve Rodgers was looking so different that even Peggy Carter couldn't control herself. Look at this girl, look at her. But oh nah, Steve Rodgers went from 5'5" to 6'3", 235 pounds. They turned this man into a super player. And it wasn't long after he hit the practice field where they realized that they had a new secret weapon. Steve Rodgers was going to be a problem for opposing teams, and they had no doubt in their mind that he was already going to be QB1. There was no battle needed at this point. They just wanted to get into it and see exactly what he can do on the field. And it was actually the perfect time for them to put him out there because the Army was heading into one of the toughest games on their schedule. They were about to head on the road into a matchup against one of the top teams in the conference, as they're set to face off against the Tulane Green Wave. Now, Steve Rodgers knew how tough it might be for the Army to produce on offense because it turns out that they run a triple option. By far one of the worst offenses in all of college football, but you know what, y'all? Steve knew that he would still find a way to make it work, as he is already coming up with a big play here on 3rd down and 8 and flipping the field completely to get them inside the red zone. Now, unfortunately, this offense would end up getting stopped on 3rd down, but I don't know where it seems like they're actually going to go for it on 4th down and 4, and it turns out that Steve was able to extend this play for a touchdown. Steve Rodgers puts the Army up by 7 in this game to set the tone for the team, because soon they would get the ball right back in the first quarter, and they were once again driving towards the end zone, bringing us to a 3rd down and 5 where Steve had just enough time to get this to his running back, and he was able to get upfield and get into the end zone for another touchdown for the Army. They go up by 2 possessions in this game before coming to the second quarter. We're on a 3rd down and 12 there, running a triple option play to try and pick up a 1st down, but it's looking like Steve Rodgers might be able to get more than that, because he is turning it upfield and it looks like he's outrunning these defenders, and just like that, man, Steve Rodgers is gone. He is taking this one the distance for his 3rd touchdown of the day, and it's looking like he's brought all the momentum towards the Black Knights' way. Because by the second half, even though Steve only had 62 yards through the air, he definitely had no problem picking up some big yards on the ground, as he was pretty much torching Tulane with his legs all day, bringing us to a 1st and goal where Steve would power his way across for another touchdown on the day, extending the Army's lead by 3 possessions and officially doing enough to put this game away. The Army gets their first win with Steve Rodgers at quarterback. And Steve actually had a great performance in his debut, especially on the ground, because he almost went for 200 yards and had 3 touchdowns. He was dominant in his first game, and the coaches were happy with what they were seeing. But they definitely wanted to see even more with them heading into another big game. The Army was going on the road to face off against one of their biggest rivals on the schedule, with the Black Knights set to face off against the Air Force. Now, things are definitely going well for the Army here on their opening drive, as Steve Rodgers finds a man to the right side of the field who's able to turn it up and get the team in scoring range. Now, they did end up going for it on 4th down for some reason at their own 15, and they did not end up getting it. And in the second half, when they could have had another field goal, they literally did the same exact thing. And yeah, they did not get it again. But you know what? It's all good, because by later on in the 3rd quarter, this game is still at 3-0. And Steve Rodgers and this offense were finally getting things going for real this time. They get all the way down to the 5-yard line, where Steve actually runs a screen pass to his best friend, Bucky, who was able to take it into the end zone for a touchdown. The Army has finally taken the lead in this game, but the Air Force just takes it right back. And now the Army has less than a minute left to find a way to get downfield, but Steve Rodgers was coming up with a nice throw to help them get in scoring range. He put them at the 12-yard line with less than 30 seconds left, where after he dropped back to pass, he would find a man in the end zone for a touchdown. The Army has taken the lead in the final minute of the game, and with the help of Steve Rodgers, this team was moving on to 7-1 on the season. The Army at this point was having an incredible year, and they were thankful at this point that they were able to add a super player to their team. And the crazy thing is, man, you see, I didn't even mention this before, but Steve Rodgers' best friend since he was in Brooklyn, Bucky Barnes, is also playing football for the Army. I should probably mention though that it turns out in this universe, Bucky Barnes' full name is Bucky Liam Fortner Barnes. So for the most part, they call him Liam Fortner in this universe. But just so y'all know, this is definitely Bucky Barnes. But yeah, man, at this point, man, Steve Rodgers is really working on his leadership, and he's locked in, ready to get into his first home game with the Black Knights. They're about to try to move to 8-1 against another team that has a winning record, as they're set to face off against the Temple Owls. And I'll tell you guys what right now, man, Steve Rodgers was looking good here in the first quarter. He got his team down to the goal line before he took this read option and was just powering his way across for a touchdown. Them boys could not stop Steve Rodgers, so they even decided to go for the 2-point conversion, and they got that too. But all throughout this first half, though, Steve Rodgers was making plays. At one point, he even decided to say, hey, and pick up a nice gain for the team. But although that drive would only end in 3 points, the Army later on would come to a play where Temple was only sending 3 rushers, and Steve had more than enough time to find a player who was wide open down the left side of the field, who was able to break off some tackles, and he was taking this one the distance for a huge touchdown for the Army. The Black Knights seemed like they had complete control of this game, as Steve Rodgers was making plays all over the field. But by the time the third quarter came around, Temple would find a way to take the lead, and Steve had to help bring his team back into scoring range. So he came up with a huge play that would help bring them down to the goal line, where on 2nd and goal, Steve would just dive across for a touchdown. The Army was taking the lead back in this game as they were heading into the 4th quarter, where at this point they have all the momentum on their side, and despite them failing to convert, they still come up with another W on the season. They take down Temple 28-21, and it was another big game from Steve Rodgers. He had continued to step up and become a leader for this team on the field. But it turns out the Army was now going to need him to step up off the field, because they realized he was ready to officially become Captain America. Steve Rodgers was going to go on missions and help the Army save the world. But at the exact same time, he was also going to try and help them get to a national championship. They definitely had a long way to go as there was still a few games left in the season, but Steve was hoping that they can come up with another win here at home against Tulsa. Now, Steve Rodgers in this offense was looking good in the first half as they were frying up this defense, getting all the way to the goal line where Steve would take this read option into the end zone for a touchdown. But Tulsa throughout this first half was showing that they're going to do what they can to keep it close, because they only let up another field goal before heading into the third quarter, where at this point Steve knows that in such a close game, he's going to have to start making some plays for his team. So on this one, he decided to escape out the pocket and say, hey, just obliterating this dude's ankles and getting his team down into scoring range. Unfortunately though, Tulsa's defense would just continue to lock back in, and after an amazing defensive half from them, this game heads into overtime, where eventually Steve Rodgers was finally able to come up with another touchdown for his team, and after deciding that they were actually just going to go for the 2-point conversion, Steve is somehow able to get this around the edge and into the end zone to convert, putting the Army up by 8 and actually doing enough to win this game. The Army squeaks this one out 21-19 thanks to another solid performance from Steve Rodgers, where he did end up throwing his first interception, but luckily it didn't cost him the win. At this point though, with Steve playing as well as he had been, the coaches want to give him some more responsibilities, especially since he just continued to get better each and every single week. So heading into the next game, with the Army now being a top 25 team in the nation, they are looking to keep their win streak alive as they are going on the road to face off against UTSA. Now to start this game off, Steve Rodgers is coming out here on a 3rd and 18, where he drops back and delivers a dime to the left side of the field to Bucky Barnes. Unfortunately, this pass was not far enough to convert though, so they end up starting their next drive back on the 1, where on another 3rd down, Steve was able to find his way out to the edge and pick up the first down this time. He actually led the Army on a long drive in the second quarter. He was doing an excellent job taking time off the clock as he brought the Army all the way to 1st and goal, where he was firing this ball to the slant for a touchdown. The Army would take the lead in this game heading into the second half, where on a 3rd down and 15. It looks like Steve Rodgers is once again coming up with a big time play to move the sticks. He is doing the absolute best that he can do within this triple option offense, and he just continues to make the right reads with it as he takes this ball himself for another touchdown. Steve Rodgers has the Army up by 2 possessions in this game, and with UTSA not really showing up today, the Black Knights would come up with another win on the season. They moved to 10-1 thanks to a game where Steve Rodgers threw for almost 200 yards off of 94% completion percentage. He was damn near perfect in this game, going 17 for 18, while also going for 140 yards on the ground and 1 touchdown. And at this point, the team was just completely embracing Steve Rodgers as their leader. He was not only officially Captain America, but he was also the captain of this team. And I'd say it's rightfully deserved based on how hard he's been working and the fact that the Army is now a top 10 team in the nation. And at this point, all they have to do is just close their season out with a win for a chance to get to the college football playoffs. But it is not going to be easy heading into what is definitely the toughest game of this season. They're going to be heading into one of the most anticipated matchups in college football history, with the 10th ranked Army getting set to face off against the 15th ranked Navy. Now, it would not be long into this game before the Army would realize exactly why the Navy was 15th ranked in the country, because they were coming up with a lot of stops here against the Army in the opening half, and Steve Rodgers only had 4 passing yards by the second quarter, but all that seemed to change after Cap was able to fire this ball across the middle, coming up with the first down to give this offense some life. And on the very next play, it seems like Steve is finally able to make something happen, because he is taking this ball around the edge and he is going upfield, swerving around his defense as he is getting to the end zone for a touchdown. Steve Rodgers is tying this game up for the Army and bringing some momentum to their side, because even though the Navy would take the lead back in the second half, this offense was now getting things clicking. They were actually able to get all the way down to the goal line, where on a 4th and goal they ended up getting stopped. But this offense was still confident with Steve Rodgers as their quarterback, because he was often able to take a hit while delivering a dime downfield, as this play helps them get back into scoring range, and this time they are taking advantage as Steve is able to dive into the end zone for a touchdown. The Black Knights are battling in this game against another top 25 team in the nation, and it's looking like they might have a chance to come up with a win here after this defense gets a stop. The Army gets the ball with less than 30 seconds left with a chance to win this game. And on a play where Cap recognized a shift in this coverage, he saw that there was a player wide open, so he decided to throw it up. And it was caught! This receiver is taking this one the distance for a touchdown in the final moments of the game. Thanks to Captain America, this team is able to close this one out and take down the 15th ranked team in the nation. And they definitely could not have got it done without their quarterback Steve Rodgers, who had an incredible performance in the biggest game of the year, and overall he was just playing outstanding, which is exactly why at some point he would end up getting kidnapped and he was taken to somebody's facility because it turns out that there was one school that wanted Captain America to transfer there immediately. But Captain America knew that was not going to be possible, especially with the Army heading into the conference championship. They were having one of their best seasons in program history, and they now had a chance to potentially make their first ever college football playoff, where all they had to do was just come up with a win in a rematch against the 15th ranked Navy. Now, with Steve Rodgers having a pretty good understanding of how this defense plays, he came out here absolutely locked in throughout this game, coming up with a touchdown early on to help this one be tied by the second half. Where on 2nd and 5, Cap is running the speed option before speeding upfield past this defense. He is just streaking down the field as he makes his way all the way towards the end zone for a touchdown to put his team up by 7, at least until the Navy would quickly tie this game back up. But now with around 2 minutes left, the Army seems like they have control of this game. They were already in scoring range before they got to a play where Steve would roll out left and fire this ball to Bucky Barnes while taking a hit, allowing Bucky to come up with a reception before getting across the goal line for a touchdown. The Army takes the lead in this one in the final minutes of the game, and thanks to Bucky Barnes and Steve Rodgers, it looks like the Army is heading to the college football playoffs, as the Black Knights take down the Navy 21-14 for the second week in a row. And it was another performance where Steve was making the most out of this triple option offense, going for almost 300 yards and 3 touchdowns. At this point in the year though, with the season coming to a close, it turns out that the head coach would end up winning Coach of the Year. Not just him though, because the offensive coordinator would also win an award, but they both knew a big reason why they were receiving any recognition was because of Steve Rodgers, who ended up winning the Shaun Alexander Award for the best freshman in the nation. He was also earning himself a place as a second-team All-American, where in half a season he was able to put up over 1,700 yards through the air and 1,000 yards on the ground. Steve Rodgers had become a dominant player for the Army as they were now heading into the college football playoffs. Many people were wondering though how long they would be able to keep this win streak alive, especially with them heading on the road in their first game against the Louisville Cardinals. Now the Army had definitely struggled a little bit in this game, but after running a crazy QB counter, Steve Rodgers would finally shift the momentum for the Black Knights as he is coming up with a huge play that gets his team all the way across the goal line for a score. The Army comes up with a touchdown here in the second quarter before finding themselves down again in the third, where Steve decided it was time for this team to really lock in as he delivered a dime to the right side of the field that allowed this receiver to take it in stride to the end zone for a touchdown, putting the Army up briefly again in this game before Louisville would take the lead right back. And with 2 minutes left, the Black Knights absolutely needed to come up with a play, so they decided to just use the one that they scored on last time as Steve Rodgers delivers another pass to the right side for a touchdown. The Army takes the lead in the fourth quarter of this game and have already done enough to move on to the next round of the playoffs. This team is looking unstoppable with Captain America after taking down the 8th ranked squad in the nation. But as happy as this was making Steve, he was even happier to get a message from Peggy. And I don't know where Steve seemed to have built up the courage to shoot his shot, so he did. And it's looking like Steve and Peggy are locked in together now, man. Hey, that's good for them. But Steve knows that right now he has to stay locked in with his team, especially since they were heading into a game where they would face off against the best team that they've seen all year. They are no longer facing off against these American Conference Mountain West type of teams, man. The Army is about to match up against the #1 team in the nation. So for a chance to move on to the semifinals, the Black Knights will have to take down the Penn State Nittany Lions. Now, although Steve Rodgers does not hate the triple option, he definitely does not like it, because this fumble on the opening drive would cause them to come up with no points, which luckily was fine since Penn State wasn't able to come up with any either, bringing us to the second quarter where Penn State was just not able to get Steve Rodgers to the ground. He extended this play for damn near like 10 seconds before finally finding a man downfield, bringing us to a 1st and goal where Cap would take this read option himself and come up with a touchdown to give his team the lead. The Army had a ton of momentum in this game after they actually completed the 2-point conversion, bringing us to the end of the first half where they were now threatening to put up even more points. They were right back down at the goal line with less than 10 seconds left, where Steve would rip this ball to the slant for another touchdown. The Army was extending their lead again before Penn State would tie this game up by the 4th quarter, bringing us to a 3rd down where Steve knew that he just had to find a way to keep this drive alive, which he would definitely be able to do after he found a bunch of open space. And now Steve was heading upfield towards the red zone before jumping over a guy and getting his team into scoring range, where it turns out that on this 3rd down, Steve Rodgers would get sacked, forcing the Army to only settle for a field goal, which gives Penn State a ton of time to go downfield and potentially win this game. But they don't! The Army is coming up with a huge upset victory against Penn State. They are getting the job done against the #1 team in the nation. And rightfully so, man. When they have a guy like Steve Rodgers, it's safe to say that they were definitely confident moving forward. Because soon they were now heading into a game against a team that was actually recovering pretty well since firing their old head coach. But at this point, the Army was just one game away from the national championship, if they could just find a way to take down the Michigan Wolverines. Now, this game was not starting off well for the Army as Steve Rodgers throws a pick. Definitely not how Cap envisioned it would go, as Michigan takes the 7-0 lead, bringing us to a 3rd down and goal where this Army offense is still struggling to put up a touchdown. They find themselves in a situation where they are down 7-3 in the first half, but they have a chance to put up some points after Cap finds a man downfield on this play. They end up getting back down to the goal line with less than 10 seconds left in the half, where Steve Rodgers drops back and finds a man to the right side of the field for a touchdown. The Black Knights are able to take the lead here in the second quarter before they would find themselves down in the second half. Where at this point, the Black Knights are hoping that they can just get a couple more yards to get themselves to overtime, but it's looking like they might have a chance to come up with a win. Steve Rodgers was coming up pretty clutch here in the final moments of this game, especially on 3rd down where he would find another man open to move the chains for the Army, bringing us to a 2nd down and goal with less than 15 seconds left in this game. And Steve Rodgers knows that his team needs somebody to show up big. And he knew exactly who it would be after he fired this ball to his best friend Bucky, who comes up with a touchdown. Bucky Barnes is holding on to this ball in the final moments of this game. He is coming up with a score to help put the Army back on top, and thanks to he and his best friend / quarterback Steve Rodgers, the Black Knights are heading back to the national championship. The first time that they will be doing so since 1945, and it's safe to say that this coaching staff was ecstatic. They now had a chance to make history, and it was largely because of Steve Rodgers. In the second half of the season, he's got them in great position to compete for a national title. And now they finally will have a chance to claim one, as they are heading into the final game of the year. But it was definitely not going to be an easy one, with Steve Rodgers facing off against the same team that had kidnapped him earlier in the season. They will have to battle against one of the most evil and villainous squads in the nation, with Captain America and the Army set to face off against the Red Skull and the Texas Tech Red Raiders. Now, on one of the first plays of the game, Steve Rodgers was fumbling the ball, and the Red Raiders were picking it up and taking it all the way back for a touchdown. The second game in a row where Steve is starting the game off with a turnover, but this time it goes for a score. Now, the Army would try to bounce back on the next drive, but they would end up getting stopped on 3rd down, forcing them to settle for 3 heading into the second quarter. Where at this point, Steve realized that it's time for him to start taking over this game, man, so he rolls out to his right, and he has a ton of room in open space before eventually diving into the end zone for a touchdown. Captain America is helping the Army take the lead here early on before the Red Raiders take it right back. But now that he is back down in this game, Cap is determined to continue to make some big plays, even if that means that he has to say excuse me, and take some dude's ankles as he picks up a big gain for the team. Now, unfortunately, this drive would only end in 3 points, and Texas Tech would take a 2-possession lead heading into the second half. Where at this point, it is not looking too good for the Army as they have a long field ahead of them. But everything would seem to change after Steve would find a man wide open who was able to come up with the catch and completely flip the field. Steve was able to bring his team into scoring range before flipping his ball out to the running back and allowing him to turn upfield for a play that ended up in the end zone. The Army is creeping back into this game with a touchdown that puts them down by 1 possession. And now in the fourth quarter, they have a chance to lock in and take the lead. So Steve knows that he might have to take off and run, which he does here for a huge gain that is bringing his team well into scoring range, bringing his team to the 1-yard line where he would find his running back in the flat for a touchdown. Captain America has given his team the lead in the final minutes of this game, and all he has to do now is just hope that his defense can come up with a stop, and they don't. The Army has no timeouts left, and they have less than a minute to go in order to get downfield. Steve Rodgers is trying to come up with some plays, but this time is just continuing to tick off the clock. And by the time that it is 3rd down and 2, there is around 20 seconds left, and it's looking like there's no chance that the Army is going to find a way to get themselves downfield, as just nobody is able to come up with a play, bringing us to a 4th down and 2 that could possibly end this game. But Steve was able to read this defense and find a man on the left side of the field to keep the Army alive. And at this point, Steve had to let the Red Raiders know that there was absolutely no quit in Captain America.
You just don't know when to give up, do you? I can do this all day.
Because the Army would get to a 1st down and 10 where they had to come up with a play and get out of bounds. So Steve would fire this ball to the left side of the field for a huge play. He is getting his team into field goal range with less than 10 seconds left. Absolutely ripping the hearts out of the Red Skull and the Red Raiders because they know that the Army led by Captain America has just found a way to win the national championship. The Black Knights are back on top of the college football world for the first time since 1946, which actually at this point was only a couple years ago, but that's not the point. This team led by Steve Rodgers has proved that they are the #1 team in the nation. And it was mostly because of Captain America that they are now national champions. But after a season where Steve Rodgers had an incredible year, going for almost 4,000 total yards and 35 total touchdowns, he was definitely considered to be one of the best players in all of college football. But at this point, he now has to spend some more time as Captain America, where unfortunately one day he was actually attacked by the Red Skull, and oh no, his best friend Bucky was holding on for dear life, but oh, Bucky Barnes ends up falling to his death. And on top of that, the Red Skull and his organization called Hydra was sending a plane full of bombs to New York City. Luckily, Steve was able to take over the plane, but oh man, he knew there was only one way to put a stop to this. So he had to say goodbye to his girlfriend Peggy because Captain America was crashing into the ice, and it's looking like this is the end of Steve Rodgers. But then one day he woke up, but immediately Steve started to get a little suspicious because something didn't seem right. So he decided to break out of the walls, and oh nah, what is going on? Steve Rodgers found himself in New York City, but 50 years in the future. Because it turns out that there was actually a man named Nick Fury who was recruiting Cap to be a part of a special team of football players. But this was only the beginning of Nick Fury's recruitment, because there was another player that he was looking to talk to soon as well. And it turns out that they would need all the help that they can get, because there were some monsters out there that were looking to cause problems and destroy the entire multiverse by becoming the most dominant football players of all time. And I'm gonna tell y'all right now, man, these guys do not play fair. It seems like there was nothing that could stop them. These dudes were absolutely pure evil. And Nick Fury knew that he had to get a team together as soon as possible if they wanted any chance at all at stopping them. But this was Steve Rodgers, aka Captain America, in College Football 26. And if you want to see what happens next, be sure to get this video to 1,000 likes and subscribe to the channel down below. Also be sure to comment down below who else you guys want to see next, and YouTube thinks you'll like one of these other stories until the next one comes out. If you got to this point in the video, just know that I appreciate you more than you'll ever know. I hope you all have a great rest of your week, and other than that, I'm gonna catch you guys next time.